In the bright exam room, a spotted bobcat stood on the wooden table and screamed at the doorway while the man who once tried to kick him stepped in again. The threat of losing him hung in the air like another raised boot. Evan leaned over the table, hands flat on the wood, feeling that wild body shake and sensing the bobcat was fighting for more than himself. To understand why this fragile guardian chose that moment to stand his ground beside me, we had to go back to the quiet days when the clinic felt ordinary. The first wind of October slid along the clinic windows, making the glass sing in a thin, uneasy tone. I was alone with the overhead lights and the smell of disinfectant. Finishing charts he'd put off all week. Nothing moved. Yet I kept glancing at the door as if someone was standing just outside. The air felt watched, the way it does before a storm finally decides to break. A soft scrape came from the reception area, like rubber shifting on tile. I set my pen down and listened, holding my breath until the clock over the doorway seemed too loud. No voices, no footsteps, only the faint hum of the furnace kicking on. When I stepped into the hall, the sound vanished, leaving my heart beating harder than the moment really deserved. I told myself buildings make noises when they settle. At the front entrance, one of my boots sat at an odd angle. I always lined them up heel to heel beneath the coat hooks. A small private ritual at opening and closing. Now one was nudged forward, toe pointing toward the exam rooms, as if guided by an unseen hand. I picked it up, checking the sole for debris, and felt the leather still faintly warm against my palm. That made no sense at all. The rubber mat before the glass door had a shallow depression pressed into it, right where people usually stand to peer inside. It was small, not big enough for my boot print, and too distinct to be a wrinkle. I brushed my hand over it, expecting grit or dampness, but felt only smooth rubber and the memory of weight. Drafts and delivery guys, I muttered. Though drafts don't haggle with gravity. As I turned away, a streak on the lower part of the door caught my eye. A small smear of moisture curved across the glass, low to the ground, followed by a few faint, parallel lines. It looked like a damp nose had pressed there and then dragged sideways. Whisker traces ghosted behind. I wiped it with a tissue, telling myself it had been there since yesterday and I'd simply missed it. Later, while prepping vaccines in exam room 2, another sound came alight. Quick patter overhead, as if something small crossed the drop ceiling and then stopped. I froze, syringe in hand, staring at the light fixture. The patter didn't repeat. Instead, a subtle vibration ran down one wall, like a heartbeat felt through plaster. I swallowed, annoyed by how easily my imagination borrowed from horror movies. On my drive home, the clinic's reflection in the diner window caught my attention. For a moment, I could have sworn a small shape sat by the front steps, perfectly still under the street lamp. A compact silhouette, tail short, head rounded, like a stone that had learned to breathe. When I turned my head to look directly, nothing waited there. Only wet pavement and the glow of our sign. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I could feel the day clinging to me. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually settles my nerves, but my shoulders stayed tight. Every creak of the house sounded like the clinic's hallway. Somewhere behind my ribs, a thought I'd tried to ignore kept whispering that the building wasn't empty after dark, and whatever shared its air was still on watch. The next morning, the first thing I noticed wasn't the coffee pot or the appointment list. It was a damp mark on the reception floor, just inside the door. 4 small impressions pressed into the tile, spaced too close together for a dog, too neat for a careless smear. I crouched down, fingertip hovering above the faint arcs. Something light had paused there, then moved on with intention. Out back, by the dumpster, gravel told the same quiet story. Little crescents of disturbed stone looped around the corner of the building, crossing my usual path to the parking lot. They weren't boot marks. They were smaller, more delicate, arranged in a careful sequence. The trail ended under a narrow band of scrub behind the clinic, where pine needles were brushed smooth, as if something had nested there a few careful hours. By mid-morning, the strange feeling returned, prickling between my shoulder blades. I opened exam room 1 and stopped cold. On the wooden exam table, it installed to make nervous owners feel better, a tiny, spotted shape stood near the far edge. Tufted ears, wide paws, short black-tipped tail. There was no mistaking what it was. A very young, wild neighbour, staring at me as if I were late for an appointment. We looked at each other for a long heartbeat. The little body stood with legs spread, claws barely visible against the wood, sides moving fast with each breath. Then, without panic, it hopped down, landing with a sound softer than paper. It trotted past me through the partially open door, close enough that I could feel the cool brush of air in its wake, then vanished down the hallway like it knew the floor plan. I followed in a daze, finding the back door an inch ajar, latch not fully engaged. Outside, the gravel was scattered in a short line of motion that disappeared near the old maple. Just a stray, I told myself out loud, as if saying it made things simpler. A wanderer from the hills. A youngster horde lost its way. Our town had barns and woods. Sometimes the borders got blurred. Still, the image stayed with me through appointments and paperwork. The pattern of its coat, the purposeful way it had chosen the table, the calm exit instead of a wild scramble. My mind tried to shrink it into something domestic, something that could be claimed or collared. But late that afternoon, when Mrs. Hanley's terrier came in, the dog stopped dead in the doorway, nose working overtime at some invisible trail along the baseboards. At closing, as I switched off lights, a familiar outline appeared under the street lamp across the road. The little wild one sat near the curb, facing the bend where the diner sign glowed and cars slowed to turn. It wasn't watching the clinic at all. It was watching the street, body tense whenever headlights grew larger. I stood behind the glass, hand on the lock, feeling an unexpected tug of worry. I slept badly again, replaying the way the youngster's eyes had fixed not on me, but on that stretch of pavement. There was a purpose there I couldn't quite read, like a warning written in a language of pause and patience. I told myself in the dark that it would move on, that wild things rarely linger in town. Even as I said it, part of me hoped that, just this once, I was wrong. Long before it ever stepped onto my exam table, the little wild thing learned the rules of our town's edges. It was born beneath a fallen log wedged between two boulders, at the seam where backyards frayed into brush. Up above, tires hissed and roared along the highway, sending vibrations through the soil like distant thunder. Down below, it nuzzled against its mother's flank and memorized her steady heartbeat. The first time it followed her to the ditch, the world opened in overwhelming colour and scent. Exhaust fumes, damp earth, spilled grain from passing trucks. So many stories riding the air. The older body moved with silent certainty, keeping low, pausing in shadows. When a pickup roared by too close, flinging gravel into the ditch, the youngster felt pebbles sting its flank. It flinched back, filing away the lesson. Distance mattered. They hunted the in-between places, the fringe where barns leaned and fences sagged. Behind one feed store, the pair discovered an open bin, rich with grain, dust, and mice. Humans moved around them in regular patterns. Some walked slowly, voices soft, boots planting carefully. Others slammed doors and shouted across parking lots, their movements jerky and unpredictable. The youngster watched them all, learning which sounds meant safety and which required vanishing. Winter pressed hard that year, laying a thick crust of ice on everything that dared stand still. One heavy snow, a hay barn roof buckled and collapsed, burying their best hunting ground under twisted lumber and tin. The pair shifted closer to town, drawn by the warmth leaking from houses and the easy pickings near dumpsters. One narrow street, with its glowing windows and steady hum. became part of their nightly route. Near the clinic, trash cans lined up like metal trees, each one a potential feast or disappointment. The mother moved cautiously, checking each scent, while the smaller body bounced a step ahead, curious and impulsive. Once, as it slipped toward a promising smell, a man on a porch kicked a bottle into the yard, laughing when it shattered against a post. The youngster bolted, ears ringing, heart pounding with confusion and new distrust. Over time, trust became a luxury it could not afford to spend lightly. A hand reaching down from a porch railing might offer scraps or sudden pain. A quiet truck could carry someone kind or someone careless. The only reliable indicators were patterns. Who moved slowly, who slammed doors, who threw things at shapes in the dark. The youngster watched from hedges and culverts, mapping those patterns with patient eyes. Then came the morning when its mother did not return to the shadow under the familiar willow. Fog clung to the roadside, muffling sound, muting colour. The little body waited, nose pressed into the flattened grass, breathing in the fading scent. Hours stretched longer than any winter night. Eventually, the world clarified around a quiet absence, and the young watcher learned another rule. Sometimes the ones who always come back simply do not. Its roots tightened after that. The world shrank to a handful of favoured paths. Along the creek, past the feed store, behind the diner, and down the street where the clinic lights burned steady. Two particular crossing spots on the road felt safest, with wide shoulders and good sightlines. It studied every vehicle, every pair of legs, every raised hand. The sound of shouting near asphalt dug deep into its bones. As seasons turned, the small body lengthened, but the sense of responsibility grew faster than muscle. Something had happened on that street once. Something wrong and sharp, sealing a private promise in its chest. Whether it had witnessed a thrown object, a slammed door, or a shape struck in the road, the memory sharpened into duty. The clinic's front step became a lookout post, and the young wild thing appointed itself the town's smallest guardian. Long before I noticed nose smudges on my door, it had memorized the particular rhythm of my truck engine. My boots never stomped or kicked, only thudded in a consistent, careful pattern. I didn't yell into the night or hurl bottles into ditches. From the shadows, the watcher marked me down as different. Not entirely safe, but at least not yet dangerous. When it finally stepped inside my clinic, its choice was already made. 2 mornings after our first clear meeting, I found it curled in the laundry room, nestled on top of folded towels as if they'd been arranged for a guest. The washer thumped gently beside it, white noise that might have scared other creatures away. its shoulders rose and fell, but the eyes were open, tracking me from the doorway. Fear was there, but so was calculation, like it was gauging exactly how fast I could move. I stood with a basket of clean blankets, trying not to look like a threat. Up close, the spots along its ribs were more intricate than he'd realized, like ink brushed onto soft fur. "You picked the warmest corner in the building," I said quietly. My voice sounded too loud in the cramped room, so I softened it, letting each word land slow. The youngster's ears twitched, but it did not bolt. Instead, it unfolded itself slowly and stepped down from the towels, paws landing without a sound. It walked past me, close enough that I could hear its breath, and moved into the hallway with deliberate steps. At the junction, it paused and looked back over its shoulder. I had the strangest feeling it was checking whether I was following, the way a child might glance back to be sure a parent hadn't disappeared. Curiosity pulled me along. It padded toward the reception area, claws ticking faintly on tile. At the front door, it sat just inside the glass, body angled toward the bend in the street. Outside, morning sunlight slanted across cracked pavement and the diner sign flickered awake. Each time a car approached the curve, the little watcher leaned forward slightly, muscles tensing until the vehicle passed and did not stop. "Is this your station?" I asked under my breath. I took a step closer and heard a soft, warning rumble. Not full-throated aggression, more like a reminder of boundaries. I stopped where I was, hands visible, letting it see it heard the message. Its tail flicked once, then stilled, gaze never leaving that stretch of road. It seemed to relax only when the school bus rolled by at its familiar, patient pace. Later that week, I arrived before dawn to set up for a surgery and turned on the exam room light to an unexpected sight. The little wild watcher stood on the wooden table again, paws planted wide. But this time something lay carefully arranged between its front feet. A small grey mouse, completely intact, body still limber, placed squarely in the centre of the grain like an offering. We stared at each other across the table. "Is that for me?" I asked, hearing how absurd it sounded. The youngster blinked slowly, then nudged the mouse an inch closer with its nose, claws scraping faintly. It looked less like play and more like a very pointed gesture. "I handle the outside threats. Here is proof. Your turn is next. If you're paying attention." Instead of reaching for the mouse, I went to the cupboard and took out a shallow dish. I filled it with fresh water and set it at the far end of the table, then backed away, palms open. The watcher slid sideways, keeping one eye on me while lowering its head to drink. Even while lapping, Its ears stayed angled toward the hallway, listening for footsteps, for engines, for trouble arriving late. When the first client of the day knocked, the little guardian vanished as if pulled on a string, slipping under a cabinet and out through the back like smoke. Only the mouse remained to prove I hadn't imagined the encounter. I disposed of it and wiped the table, but my hand lingered on the warm wood. Whatever this small neighbour wanted, it wasn't just crumbs or shelter. It was trying, in its own wild way, to talk. In small towns, stories travel faster than mail. By the end of that week, he'd heard 3 different versions of the same rumour over coffee at the diner. Someone swore a spotted menace had been pacing the clinic sidewalk at night. Another claimed a baby predator had stared down her truck headlights like it owned the road. A third insisted it hissed at children on bikes, though no one could name the children. I listened, stirring my coffee while the waitress raised an eyebrow in my direction. "You seen anything weird over there, Doc?" she asked lightly. I shrugged, keeping my voice neutral. "Plenty of weird," I said, "but nothing that's done worse than still trash." The man 2 stools down snorted and muttered something about waiting until it takes a chicken or worse. The words settled over me like extra weight in my coat. Outside, I watched my little guardian from the clinic window more carefully. It had started showing up earlier in the evenings, taking its post near the front step before it even locked up. It paced a precise line along the curb, back and forth, pausing only to stare at the bend in the road. Whenever a particular white sedan rounded that corner, its body stiffened, tail tip twitching, eyes narrowing with unmistakable recognition. One rainy Thursday, I stepped out to bring in the sandwich board sign and found myself suddenly in the middle of everything. The white sedan pulled up too close to the curb, rear tyre splashing through a puddle where the youngster often lingered. The little body leapt back, hind legs skidding on wet concrete. The driver's door flew open so hard it bounced, and a stocky man in a stained jacket climbed out, already cursing. "Damn vermin," he snapped, spotting the wild youngster under the bench near the door. In one angry movement, he drew his boot back, clearly intending to slam it into the small, crouched body. Time stretched. I saw the arc his leg would take, the vulnerable spine in its path, the wet pavement slick beneath them both. Before my brain caught up, my hands were already moving, dropping the sign and lunging forward. I caught his ankle mid-swing, fingers digging into denim and muscle. The momentum nearly pulled me off balance, but I held, forcing his foot back toward the ground. "Stop," I said, more breath than voice. Under the bench, the little watcher flattened itself, ears pinned, eyes so wide The gold almost swallowed the dark. The man wobbled, then cursed louder, bracing one hand on the car. What the hell? Evan, he barked, yanking his leg free. I recognized him now. Gary, regular at the diner, fond of loud opinions and cheap beer. That thing's dangerous. It'll go after kids. You know that, right? His breath smelled like stale hops and frustration. Across the street, curtains twitched, and a silhouette appeared in the diner window, watching the scene unfold with cautious interest. I straightened slowly, rain dripping from my hair into my collar. You don't get to kick anything in front of my clinic, I said, keeping my tone level. If there's a problem, it's my job to handle it, not yours. His jaw worked, cheeks flushing deeper red. For a moment I thought he might take a swing, but his eyes flicked to the clinic sign, to the watchers behind glass, and calculation cooled his temper. Fine, he spat, jerking his jacket straight. When it tears someone up, don't say I didn't warn you. He slammed his door hard enough to rattle the frame and roared off, tires hissing on wet asphalt. Under the bench, the young guardian trembled, fur clinging in spikes to its narrow sides. I crouched, meeting its gaze. You picked a rough sidewalk to love, I murmured. It blinked slowly, as if agreeing. That night, alone in my office, the scene replayed on a loop. The raised boot, the weight of his ankle in my hands, the sheer helplessness in those golden eyes when the blow seemed inevitable. Outside, I could see a small shape through the blinds, pacing the same strip of curb, stopping only to stare toward the bend in the road. Duty never sleeps. Apparently, even when your paws are still shaking. By morning, I realized this wasn't sustainable. Rumors were growing teeth, and it was only a matter of time before someone called the county or took matters into their own clumsy hands. During my lunch break, I called the state wildlife office. I explained about a juvenile bobcat hanging around town, about my training, about my clinic setup. After too many transfers and a pile of forms, I applied for a temporary rehabilitation permit. The day the approval came through, rain had washed the world clean. I opened the back door of the clinic and waited, heart tapping out a nervous rhythm against my ribs. As if summoned, the little guardian appeared at the alley's end, trotting toward me with its usual mixture of caution and certainty. It slipped inside without hesitation, pausing only once to glance back at the street, as if clocking out from one job to start another. We made the exam room as calm as possible for our first official check. I swapped the sterile metal table for the wooden one, dimmed the overhead lights, and placed a folded towel on the right side like a stage mark. The little bobcat hopped up with an ease that said it had been waiting for this invitation. It stood tall on that towel, paws spread, tail tip twitching with restrained nerves. Under the bright task lamp, every detail sharpened. Its ear tufts flicked with each sound from the hallway. The spots along its shoulders looked like soft ink droplets. Its paws were comically large for its body. Toes splayed slightly as it shifted weight. I planted my hands on the left edge of the table, leaning in to get a better look at its eyes. They were huge, gold, and unblinking, studying me with equal intensity. "Okay, street watcher," I murmured. "If you're planning to keep guarding that road, we're putting your name on a chart." As if offended by paperwork, the bobcat suddenly opened its mouth wide and let out a ragged, surprisingly loud cry. It wasn't a hiss or a growl. It sounded like a furious, hoarse protest speech in a language of rasping syllables and sharp breaths. I actually jerked back, then laughed nervously. Before I could respond, the front door slammed open hard enough to rattle the waiting room windows. Raised voices tumbled down the hallway ahead of footsteps. A moment later, Gary strode into the exam room without knocking, cheeks flushed, jaw clenched. Beside him stood a woman in a town council badge and sensible shoes, eyes already narrowed at the sight of spots and ear tufts on the table. "There it is," Gary barked, jabbing a finger toward the bobcat. "Told you he was keeping a wild killer right in town, right where kids walk past every day." The councilwoman's gaze flicked from the animal to my face, weighing liability, a fear, public opinion. The bobcat turned slowly toward them, ears pricked, body coiling into a stance that somehow made it look both tiny and unyielding. The room's air thickened with tension. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the bobcat stepped forward on the towel, closing the distance toward me instead of them. It planted its front paws so firmly the wooden surface gave a faint, answering thump. Leaning toward Gary, it opened its mouth again and unleashed a longer, even louder cry, right into the charged air between us all. Its whole small frame vibrated with the effort. The sound startled Gary enough that he took a half step back, instinctively drawing his boot up as if to kick at the table's edge. My body reacted before my brain caught up. I dropped the chart and slammed both hands flat on the wood beside the bobcat's paws, leaning over it like a shield. "You will not touch him," I said, voice low, but carrying every ounce of conviction I had left. The councilwoman blinked, taken aback less by the bobcat's noise than by the sight of a grown man nearly kicking an animal already restrained by circumstance. The bobcat did not back down. It kept yelling, voice cracking, eyes locked on Gary's face as if repeating every accusation it had ever seen written into his behaviour on the street. The room felt suddenly very small, like a courtroom packed into a shoebox. Something shifted behind the councilwoman's eyes. I saw it in the way her shoulders eased, in the slight downturn at the corners of her mouth. She stepped between Gary and the table, palm raised. "That's enough," she said firmly. "He has a legal rehab permit. And from where I'm standing, that little fellow looks more frightened and determined than dangerous." She turned to me. "You'll keep him secure." I nodded, hands still flat on the wood, heart pounding. "He came here on his own," I said. "Has been watching that road for months. I'm just trying to make sure he survives long enough to finish whatever job he thinks he has." The bobcat's cries softened into hoarse huffs, but it remained in place. Paws pressed against the table, body angled protectively between me and Gary as if our roles had reversed. Gary muttered under his breath and stomped out, the doorframe trembling in his wake. The councilwoman lingered a moment, eyes on the bobcat. "You know," she said quietly. "Folks are already calling him your little guardian. Might be easier to lean into that than fight it." Then she left too, heels clicking down the hall. Silence wrapped the exam room like a blanket. Slowly, I leaned closer until my face was just inches from the bobcat's. Up close, I could see tiny teeth, the pink of his tongue, the way his whiskers trembled with aftershocks of adrenaline. Our eyes met, and for the first time, I truly understood. Every night on that curb, every tense glance at the bend, every small offering had been a warning, a demand that someone else start paying attention. "You argued your own case," I whispered. I reached for the stethoscope with hands that still shook a little and placed the cold disc gently against the bobcat's chest. His heartbeat hammered fast but steady, like a drum roll at the end of a verdict. He finally closed his mouth, letting out one last rasp of air, and pressed his paws a fraction deeper into the wooden table between us, as if to seal a pact. In that quiet, I realized my life's job description had just changed. After that day, the story retold itself around town in softer tones. At the diner, people stopped saying "spotted menace" and started saying "Doc's little guardian" with a kind of cautious affection. Parents walked their kids past the clinic window, pointing out the bobcat when he sat in his reinforced pen, sunlight striping his fur. Even Gary, when he came in for blood pressure meds, kept his voice down and his boots firmly on the ground. Inside the clinic, our routines warped gently around the new resident. Mornings began with coffee for me and fresh water for him, plus a check of his enclosure and the sturdy latch on the gate. When no clients were scheduled, he'd open the pen and let him roam the hallway. His claws ticking on the tile became my favourite background noise, a living metronome pacing my paperwork and thoughts. He always returned to 3 particular spots: the wooden exam table, where he'd hop up and settle on the right side as soon as I spread a towel; the laundry room corner, with its warm hum and soft stacks, where he'd curl when storms rattled the roof; and the front window, where he'd sit for long stretches, watching the world like a security guard who took his job personally. The street had not lost his attention. In the evenings, after the last appointment, I found myself lingering more often. He'd sit on the floor near the window with a mug of tea, back against the wall, while he perched just above, nose marking faint smudges on the glass. We watched cars glide through the curve, kids pedal home, the patrol truck roll past with its quiet presence. Some nights he relaxed quickly. Other nights, his body stayed taut until long after dark. On Sundays, when the clinic was officially closed, I still came in to check on him. We developed a ritual in the small fenced yard out back. He'd open the door, and he'd step onto the patchy grass, nose lifted to sample the wind. Instead of trying to climb out, he'd circle once, then choose the corner where he could see the bend in the road through a gap in the boards. Even off duty, he refused to stop watching. Through him, the town changed shape for me. I began noticing which houses always had broken bottles in their ditches and which porches were swept every morning. I learned which cars sped carelessly through the curve and which slowed instinctively. I found myself stepping out of the clinic more often just to stand on the sidewalk, feeling with my own bones the subtle tilt of the street. His vigilance had become contagious. Our shared patrol wasn't grand or dramatic. It was quiet checks, familiar glances, small adjustments. Owners brought in their pets and glanced at the Bobcat through the window, reassured in ways they couldn't quite name. I caught myself, more than once, resting a hand on the wooden table's claw-scratched edge and thinking that for a town our size, one determined little wild guardian and one stubborn vet weren't such a bad line of defence. A year later, he no longer fit anyone's idea of tiny, but in my mind he was still the wide-eyed youngster under the bench on that rainy day. His shoulders had broadened, muscles moving smoothly under the spotted coat. Yet he still liked to perch on the right side of the wooden table, just fitting, paws overlapping old scratches he'd left there as a growing apprentice. The table had become our shared landmark. The town had woven him into its stories. Kids drew pictures of the clinic guardian in school, complete with ear tufts and a window. Delivery drivers announced themselves loudly at the door, joking that they didn't want to spook my security system. Even the councilwoman dropped by now and then, leaning on the reception counter while watching him watch the street. This once controversial presence had turned into a quiet source of pride. On mild evenings, I took a folding chair out to the front steps after closing, thermos in hand. He would sit beside me, just at the edge of the doormat, golden eyes fixed on the road's curve. We didn't need words. When a car passed a little too fast, his ears flattened and my jaw tightened in sync. When kids waved from the sidewalk, his tail twitched once, and I lifted a hand in answer for both of us. Inside, the clinic carried his legacy in small, indelible ways. The wooden table bore the marks of his claws and the faint indentation where he always settled. The front glass held tiny circles where his nose had fogged it on cold mornings. In a drawer, I kept the printed copy of his rehab authorization, edges worn from being taken out and shown to nervous officials more times than Id anticipated. Each mark was a reminder that duty can wear spots and whiskers. At the end of long days, I often stood in the darkened waiting room, keys in hand, looking back once before locking up. He would be there by the window, eyes reflecting a soft echo of the street lamp outside. Id raise my palm to the glass, and head press his nose briefly against the other side, leaving a new, faint smudge. Then head turn and pad back toward the heart of the clinic. Satisfied, walking home along the familiar sidewalk, I felt lighter knowing that in this little town, on this once worrying street, none of us were really keeping watch alone anymore. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.